The movie opens with a college professor named Richard Brown sitting in a clinic. The doctor informs him that he has lung cancer, which has also spread to his spine. He also reveals Richard will have a year to live if he accepts treatment, so he should inform his wife and daughter. Richard is now devastated and heads to his college, where he's depressed. During his lecture, he's still sad, so he leaves the lecture and walks into the college pond, where he breaks down and starts yelling.
Jesus, Jesus, God, fuck, yes, fuck my ass, Jesus.
The first chapter begins, and we meet Richard's wife Veronica and their daughter Olivia. Richard wants to share the news about his cancer, but Olivia interrupts him and comes clean that she's a lesbian. Richard is supportive, but Veronica laughs it off, claiming Olivia is just going through a phase. Olivia storms out, so Veronica reveals that she is having an affair with Henry Wright, Richard's boss and the dean of his college. Richard laughs at Veronica instead of being angry and makes fun of Henry. Veronica gets agitated that Richard isn't bothered that his wife is cheating on him, so she leaves too. She stops and asks Richard what he wanted to share with them, so he lies and doesn't mention his cancer. The next day, during his lecture, a student's phone rings. So Richard makes her stand up and attend the call. The girl, named Claire, answers the calls and ends it due to embarrassment. Due to the cancer, Richard doesn't want to deal with students, so he offers the students a C grade to leave the class if they are not interested in the subject. He narrows down the criteria and mentions if any of them have never read a book for themselves, they should leave. Now, for the remaining students, he assigns them to read a book of their choosing and will give a lecture tomorrow. He tells them the only way to receive an A grade will be if they teach something new.
And then you will stand up here and you'll persuade your peers of the work's importance. For that, you'll receive a B. If you teach us something new, you receive an A.
The students are puzzled as Richard decides to head out and dismisses everyone. He meets with his colleague and best friend named Peter for drinks. He tells Peter that he wants to go on a sabbatical because he has cancer. Peter gets shocked and sentimental, so Richard tells him to help him get the sabbatical because Peter owes him a favor, so he agrees.
You owe me, Peter.
Yes, of course.
We see Veronica with Harvey, who wants her to decorate his college since Veronica is a garden designer. At home, Richard supports Veronica's infidelity and shares pain medication with her. Their marriage has been in shambles, so they both make a deal to cheat on each other as much as they like. But they will not compromise their relationship with their daughter because of their differences. They both celebrate and do drugs. Olivia now returns home with her new girlfriend, named Taylor. The new lovebirds enter the house and find Richard and Veronica drunk and high. Veronica greets Taylor, and now she acts supportive of Olivia. The parents want Taylor to drink with them, but Olivia takes Taylor with her and leaves again. Veronica now starts wondering how their marriage fell apart, but Richard doesn't care. Before going to bed, Veronica asks Richard if Olivia hates her, so Richard assures her that Olivia hates her, but only because she's supposed to. The second chapter of the film begins, and we see Richard in his class. Only a few dedicated students show up, so Richard admires them and asks one of them for a smoke. Richard introduces himself and smokes, but it hurts his lungs. He asks the students to introduce himself, and only the annoying girl, Rose, raises her hand. Richard ignores her and asks Claire to introduce herself. Claire reveals she is the niece of Henry Wright, and she too isn't fond of him. Richard thinks the students are getting bored, so he takes them to a bar for their introductions, where only Rose is yapping, so he sends her to buy more drinks for everyone. Richard now tells his students to not just exist, but to live their lives, make messes of things, do something exciting that leaves a mark on the world because they all will die eventually.
What I want to focus on is enriching our lives and try to extract some sort of wisdom that we can carry with us.
Rose returns with the drinks, so they all make a toast to composing a meaningful story for their lives. Richard assigns Rose a book to give a lecture on and heads out. While driving with his dog, Gibbles, Richard notices Veronica's car outside of a motel, realizing she's making out with Henry. So he makes a stop next to her car and leaves a note, which says, "It works." Richard arrives home for dinner and asks Olivia about her relationship with Taylor. Veronica arrives home, so Richard makes her apologize to Olivia for dismissing her confession. But Olivia doesn't seem too bothered by her apology. The next day, we see Rose delivering a lecture on her book, but Richard is completely distracted. Richard then asks Rose's remarks about the book and gets impressed, so he gives her an A- grade. Richard now looks at the new garden decorations that Veronica made and makes fun of the monument she made. Later that day, a student named Daniel meets with Richard in his office. Daniel reveals he made pot brownies for Richard and doesn't charge him. He asks Richard if he's ever been with another man, but Richard hasn't. Daniel offers a pleasure exchange, so Richard accepts because he knows he's going to die soon anyway. Henry now holds a ribbon-cutting ceremony for Veronica and her new monument. Olivia chats with Peter and Richard as Veronica approaches them and gets praise for her work. At home, Olivia questions Richard why he and Veronica are still together. Richard reveals life doesn't turn out as you imagine, so you hold someone else accountable. Richard asks Olivia and Taylor's situation, so she reveals she is in love with Taylor. Richard is proud of her and tells Veronica that their daughter is in love. Chapter 3 begins, and we see another student giving her presentation, but Richard cuts her off and gives her a B grade. He checks on his students if they are understanding the purpose of these lectures, and then smokes pot with them. Henry and Peter notice Richard lying on the grass, smoking pot with his students, so Henry gets angry. Later at night, Peter meets with Richard at a bar and takes Richard to a support group of people going through cancer. At the support group, instead of Richard, Peter speaks about his pain, which is fear of losing his best friend. The group counselor encourages Richard to speak, but Richard blatantly refuses and heads out with Peter. They head back to the bar, where they both get drunk. Richard reveals he's dying soon, and he's trying to make peace with it. Meanwhile, they get accompanied by Claire. Richard mentions to Peter that Claire is Harvey's niece, and she too despises Harvey. Peter gets more drinks and gets wasted. Claire and Richard put him in a cab and send him to his home. They both head back inside the bar and chat. Claire admires Richard's bravery, but he considers it apathy. Richard opens up to Claire and reveals he has cancer, and he told no one else, besides Peter. Claire feels terrible for him, so she asks him to dance with her. While dancing, the cancer kicks in, and Richard falls on the floor. Peter now rushes into the hospital and finds Richard chilling in the bed along with Santiago, his emergency contact. Peter checks on Richard and tells him to improve his behavior if he wants his help for the sabbatical. Richard agrees, so Peter heads out. In the morning, Richard returns home, where a worried Veronica asks Richard where he spent the night, but he doesn't mention the cancer or the hospital. At the college, Richard gets a call from Henry's secretary calling him in for a meeting, but Richard keeps on stalling. Later, Richard meets Henry, who wants to punish Richard for his recent behavior. But Richard turns the tables on him and reveals he knows about his affair with Veronica. Richard mentions he also knows that Henry gave Veronica college funds for her monument, which is against faculty rule. He forces Henry to sign his sabbatical and leaves. Richard starts feeling pain in his chest as his condition gets worse. Chapter 4 begins, and we see the Browns family getting ready to head to a party at Peter's house. There, Peter's wife Barbara is sharing her stories from Europe, while Olivia notices Richard coughing up blood now. Richard and Peter escape Barbara's annoying stories and move to another room, where Peter reveals Richard got sabbatical. Barbara interrupts them and tells them to keep the doors open so they can hear her. Peter's marriage is also questionable, which is why he's also tired of Barbara. The Browns return home, and Veronica notices Richard in pain, but he still doesn't reveal his cancer diagnosis. The next day, Claire gives her presentation, and Richard gives her an A.
So, you get an A.
Richard's condition is getting worse, so he gives a speech to his students. He motivates them to seize every tiny moment in life and not let their lives go to waste. He reminds them how lucky they are and how much the world is dying for people like them. After the speech, Richard faints in his office as Peter arrives to check on him. Peter takes Richard to a church where Peter prays for Richard, but Richard just sits in silence. Richard reveals he's finding it hard to let go of this world because it grew on him, so Peter starts crying for him. Richard hugs Peter, thanking him for being his only true friend. Richard's condition keeps getting worse as Olivia checks on him at night. The 5th chapter begins where we see Richard and Veronica going to a faculty dinner. There, Richard gets seated separately in the back, while Veronica is seated with Henry. Henry gives a toast, but it bothers Richard, so he decides to give a toast too. He calls a waiter to stand beside him to pour more wine as he thanks people. He sarcastically praises Henry and makes fun of him. He thanks Peter for being there for him.
Your heart is truly one of gold.
It is.
And this college is very lucky to have you.
And even thanks Veronica for being a worthy adversary that pushed him to explore new aspects of life. Richard then reveals that he is dying and will die soon, meaning this is the last time he'll ever be with them because he plans on going on a sabbatical. Veronica realizes the reason Richard started acting crazy and feels guilty. Richard ends his toast by telling everyone to live with the thought of death because it will make them appreciate life even more. The sixth and last chapter begin, and we see Veronica confronting Richard about his fate. Richard apologizes for not mentioning soon, so she asks him what he's going to do now. Richard mentions leaving and tells Veronica to find happiness. He bids her farewell and heads home, where Olivia approaches him. She reveals she broke up with Taylor because she cheated on him with a boy. Richard comforts her and tells her that there are more women she can find. Olivia worries about Richard's health and asks what's happening to him. Richard finally confesses about his cancer and mentions he'll be leaving for his sabbatical, where he will probably die alone. Olivia cries and hugs him as Richard says goodbye to her for the last time. He heads out with his dog, Gibbles, and tells Olivia to make sure Veronica takes care of her. Richard drives away, crying in his car, and stops on the highway when he sees two roads, but he takes neither and creates a third option for himself by driving into the fields. The movie ends here. Thank you for being a part of our video. If these tales of mystery and intrigue sent shivers down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more bone-chilling narratives. Stay tuned. And until next time, stay captivated.